Authorities have charged a man with murder after they say he intentionally accelerated past 70 miles per hour, triggering a catastrophic 12-car crash in Las Vegas that killed 2 people. The suspect, just 19 years old, now faces scrutiny not only for the deadly collision, but also for the disturbing evidence, the defense he is expected to argue, and his reported criminal history. Middle of the day, November 18th, approximately 3:29 p.m. His pregnant girlfriend, 20-year-old Adeline Duran Rincon, and another driver, 38-year-old Edward Garcia, they were killed. They died at the scene. Another victim had to be immediately taken to the hospital after suffering life-threatening injuries. By the way, apparently, the local DA indicating there is no evidence that Gutierrez tried to stop. In fact, Clark County District Attorney Steve Wolfson said, quote, "We believe, based on all the evidence to date, including a very descriptive video, that his actions were intentional," and also indicated that Gutierrez was not under the influence of drugs or alcohol. 8 News Now Las Vegas reporting he had only trace amounts of marijuana in his system. Okay, so let me bring in Adrian Lobo, a Nevada criminal defense attorney, to talk more about this. Thank you so much for taking the time. I want to start with the charges here. So you have this guy, Jose Gutierrez, who initially faced 4 counts of reckless driving resulting in death or substantial bodily harm. This is according to the records. On Thursday, the prosecutors upgraded his charges. So according to the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, on November 20th, he was rebooked on the following charges: open murder, so 2 counts of open murder, attempted murder, and battery with use of a deadly weapon. But when you look at the court records, it also indicates that he's facing 4 counts of reckless driving, another count of attempted murder, and another count of battery. And the upgrade, I would imagine, Adrian, is because they get the blood test back. It doesn't appear that he's impaired, so they're making the argument that this was intentional murder.
It seems so with the way that the charging has occurred. Definitely. I feel like I was a bit shocked to see that it was charged as open murder. I thought maybe possibly vehicular manslaughter might be something that they would bring, but it appears that they're going to say that this was an intentional volitional act, and you can premeditate in seconds to get to a first-degree murder conviction. You also can achieve a first-degree murder conviction through a felony murder, meaning like a crime of violence. So the reckless driving and the attempted murder, they can get there through it.
Can you explain what it means when we say open murder? Because I went on the Clark County government website, and they say murder is defined by Nevada revised statutes, and they cite a statute. An open murder information or indictment charges murder in the first degree and all necessarily included offenses. These would include murder in the second degree and possibly voluntary manslaughter and involuntary manslaughter based upon the specific facts of the case. So what is open murder?
Open murder is something that we do in Nevada, meaning that they charge an open, like, homicide charge, and that the jury would get to pick, in essence, if this were to go to trial, between a first-degree murder, a second-degree murder, an voluntary manslaughter, and an involuntary manslaughter. So meaning that I presume they're going to argue that it is, I guess, a volitional, intentional act that he did this. I think that's kind of a stretch, but I think possibly they're just going to leave it open for the jury to decide, and the jury can pick from all 4 of those.
Well, I will get into his specific defense or potential defense in a minute. Putting that aside, you think it might be difficult to prove this was an intentional, volitional act if you look at the car speeding, if they have the data from the car that it speeds up like that, if there's no indication, touch the brake. I hear what you're saying. I think traditionally it's kind of unusual to charge somebody in these car crash cases with intentional murder like this, but you don't think that those factors would be enough to say that this was an intentional act, or at least you can understand it seems why the DA might move forward with that.
Right. And I think premeditation, it can happen in minutes. That's what we always hear in every sort of, homicide prosecution, that intent that's necessary can be formed in seconds. You don't have to have this elaborate plan, but it does seem that was it his intention to have a suicide homicide? Because I don't know. I mean, he's going to subject himself also to that same danger as well. But as you said, there is no slowing down. And I don't know. It's very curious to see what his defense is going to be.
Well, that is what I want to get into. It's not. I'll give you, it's not brake failure. It's not there's a problem with the car, at least as of right now, which we'll talk about. But let me ask you first about his alleged statement. So, according to KTNV Channel 13, police go to the hospital after the crash. This is where Gutierrez is being treated, and they ask him, "Were you driving?" And allegedly, he first says, yes, he confirms that he was the driver. Then he later denies it and apparently changes his story. At one point, he's asked if he was drinking before he went behind the wheel. He reportedly said the last drink that he had was the week before the crash. They ask, what about consuming marijuana? He says he didn't use any drugs in the last week. But as I mentioned, law enforcement look at his eyes. They claim they were bloodshot, they were watery. So they seemingly suspect he may not be telling the truth, especially when they get a hold of his clothes that he was wearing. And apparently they find a marijuana vape pen in a pocket. His blood is drawn for testing, and according to News 3 LV, they report that they find trace amount of basically cannabis. So this does become a question of whether or not, Adrian, look, was he impaired in some way, or is he not being honest? And I wonder if that's the bigger issue, or is he allegedly not being honest about what state he was in, the information he provided to law enforcement, and can that be used to really hurt him in an eventual case?
Right, for sure. I think there are concerns about him, changing his story multiple times. But I think one thing that I presumably is going to be fleshed out. I don't know the time period in between those two statements. I know he was treated for his own injuries, and they had talked about in that same report having trace amounts of fentanyl, but through probably the hospital administering whatever drugs to, patch him up and get him on his way. If that statement came out then, maybe some of those could be suppressible because he wasn't in his right mind, or he could offer an explanation. It just really depends on, number one, what he was treated for, the medication he was given, and was he even of sound mind to be making sense, such that the police should even be asking him questions if he's completely out of it and loopy, and if he had fentanyl in his system.
I have to ask you about this potential defense. So Gutierrez apparently told police that he suffers from untreated seizures. Now, the problem with that, according to authorities, is this is outlined in court documents, is they argue, well, if that was the case, the car would have slowed down, it would have decreased speed, it would have drifted off the road. We have a statement, by the way, from Gutierrez's attorney, Thomas Moskal. Jose Gutierrez has a documented history of seizures that the DA's office needs to investigate and consider before plowing ahead on a theory that this car crash was the commission of cold, calculated, premeditated murder of his fiancée who is carrying his unborn child. My office is in the process of gathering medical records. Adrian, what do you think about that, and how would they necessarily prove that?
Well, it's interesting, right? Because if there were medical records, and I do know Thomas Moskal, and I'm sure that he's going to be gathering them. And so whatever sort of medical episodes were, documented are going to be very helpful in this case. And obviously, if this was an involuntary act and he was having a seizure, I think that law enforcement saying that the car would have decelerated or his foot would have come off it, they just don't know. I mean, in a seizure sort of event, how your body is reacting. Yeah. And if he's stuck there, then that is what it is. I hope that they have some sort of solid documentation, because it sounds like he was never formally diagnosed. So it's going to be critical. I'm wondering where that documentation is coming from, because if you're going to the hospital or you're at school and having this sort of medical episode, obviously the ambulance are going to be called and somebody's going to rush you to the hospital and give you, some sort of seizure meds.
Yeah. And look, it's an interesting defense. I guess the question becomes, would it downgrade it from murder? Would it be, hey, this is a complete accident. This is not a murder. This is not attempted murder. This is not reckless driving. Is the goal for it to be almost like an affirmative defense? He can't be charged for anything, or is it to downgrade it?
I think it's to downgrade it. And for example, if that documentation is solid and Mr. Moscow can present that to the district attorney's office, possibly there will be some sort of negotiation that I would expect for an involuntary manslaughter, if that's a possibility. And so meaning that this was through an act that he didn't have control over. Maybe it's a voluntary, maybe it's used to negotiate to get him down, so that way he doesn't have to go to trial. But I think it's a stretch, just as Mr. Moscow put it, that he had a plan to plow through an intersection with his girlfriend who's, pregnant, and there was no signs that he was wanting to get rid of her and the child. It seems like that's a big stretch to make, that he would be willing to do that without some sort of motive.
Right. By the way, there was a little bit of mixed reporting on this. I know you looked at the court record. Maybe you have an answer. So it's being reported that he's due back in court in January for his arraignment. But then I saw that there might be even though you look at the court record, it says probable cause was found. But I saw that the judge had maybe scheduled a preliminary hearing for December 9th. But my understanding is under Nevada law, you can either present a case to a grand jury to see, if there's enough probable cause. You don't always have to go to a preliminary hearing. I don't know if you have a little bit of clarity on what hearing we can expect next, and why, if it is true, why they would want to go for a preliminary hearing as opposed to a grand jury.
I personally think that they will go for a grand jury indictment. You are correct in that, yes, there are two ways to charge. You can charge by an indictment, or you can charge by a complaint, and the complaint would go into a preliminary hearing. The grand jury indictment, I think, is probably what I would expect to happen. So if there is no preliminary hearing scheduled at the moment, I would say, or if it's kicked out very far in time, that kind of gives me some sign that they're going to go to the grand jury instead. And, one of those two things is going to happen. So you can have them simultaneously. So meaning if they're already in the grand jury and are going to present evidence, they'll keep the preliminary hearing date. So that way it's out there. And then once the indictment comes back, they'll dismiss the other case procedurally. So I would expect with two people that are severely injured, and you would have to be bringing them into court if they're able to talk, speak, and all of those things, and whatever sort of medical treatment they're having for their injuries. That's a lot. So I would think they want to make the victims comfortable, and the grand jury can give them more flexibility. And they're also not cross-examined by defense counsel.
And this is, by the way, what Jose Hernandez, the deputy chief of police, had to say, quote, "It's yet another reminder of how 10 families whose lives will be changed forever, 2 of which will not have their family members during the holidays." Really, really sad. Adrian Lobo, thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.